Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
In the immediate aftermath of the attacks on 9/11, the Bush administration swung into high gear with what it called the war on terrorism. Listening to Delmarva Today, this is Don Rush. One of the tools that the administration used was what was called enhanced interrogation techniques. Others simply describe them as torture. Government officials began pulling in psychologists as the war expanded in Afghanistan with the establishment of the base in Guantanamo Bay, where prisoners were kept for years without trial and underwent these techniques. But what about the efficacy of a psychologist becoming involved in acts that were not designed to help someone, but rather to gather intelligence and confessions? Roy Eidelson is a member of the Coalition for an Ethical Psychology and also past president of Psychologists for Social Responsibility. He's written a new book entitled Doing Harm: How the World's Largest Psychological Association Lost Its Way in the War on Terror. And we have him on the phone this afternoon. Welcome to the program.
Thanks very much.
So first of all, what compelled you to write this book, a fairly comprehensive look at this particular association?
Well, I've been involved in this struggle for almost 2 decades, trying to, along with other so-called, we call ourselves dissident psychologists, try and get the American Psychological Association to adopt new policies that were not ones that simply enforced the preferences of the Pentagon and the CIA. And I wrote the book in part because I think most people, including most psychologists, don't realize the tragic missteps that my profession took after 9/11. And if we don't understand what went wrong, if we don't understand how it is that psychologists, despite our professed do no harm ethics, ended up involved in the brutal treatment of prisoners, it can happen again, and that would be awful for everyone.
Now, as I recall, the former president, Vice President Dick Cheney, he declared that the country might have to delve into what he called the dark side in order to fight the war on terror. And obviously then opened up a quick series of prisoners being held in Guantanamo Bay, as well as black sites. It seems as if the country moved away from what we traditionally think of as civil liberties and equality, that kind of thing. I mean, there seemed to be an entire shift beyond just simply the psychologists.
Well, that's absolutely true. But psychologists and other professional associations, other civil society organizations, I think are supposed to play a crucial role as, in a sense, guardrails for democratic society. We give them power, we give them privileges, we give them the public trust, and we count on them to stand up for human rights and to oppose government misconduct. If they let us down, which in my view is what the APA did, the consequences can be dire, and in this instance, I think they were.
Because I guess the question becomes, this is a lesser of two evils in terms of the mentality of particularly those obviously who participated, but even the administration itself, which went beyond just simply holding people, sending them off to black sites, that kind of thing.
Right. What the administration did was wrong on so many accounts. And the use of torture is always abominable, and as a moral perspective, and it does not work. But what the Bush administration did was to promote 2 false narratives. One, that the people we captured were the worst of the worst. In fact, the hundreds, the thousands of detainees, almost none of them had any connection to al-Qaeda or international terrorism. The second false narrative was that torture saved lives, and that there's no evidence to support that. The Senate Intelligence Committee concluded there's no evidence to support that. But those 2 narratives encouraged the American people, the public, to embrace the war on terror as what was necessary to keep us safe. And that, in turn, led to the war in Iraq. And the APA didn't do what they should have done, in my view. They wanted to be a player in the war on terrorism. They saw it as an opportunity to expand what psychologists would do, and it led to some terrible circumstances.
We're going into dissociation. What is it that torture does not work, or these enhanced interrogation techniques don't seem to work? Because obviously we see these things on television all the time. 24, I guess, Bauer, I guess, is the most famous, but this idea that somehow you can extract this information or extract something from somebody when you torture them or use these techniques.
Right. The reason it doesn't work is if you want to obtain information, you want reliable information that you can act upon usefully. If you use torture, all you're going to do is get someone to say whatever they think you want to hear. They want the torture to end. That is true. But they may not have any information of value to you, but they'll try and come up with something that they think will appeal to you so that you will stop waterboarding, stop sleep deprivation, whatever it may be. We also know that just the basic science of how the brain works, when we are under tremendous stress, which is what torture does, we don't think as clearly. We have a harder time recalling information. We have a harder time communicating information. There's just no evidence that torture works for that purpose. What it does, it's very effective if you simply want to brutally punish someone, and it's very effective if you want to get a false confession from someone. If you want someone to admit something that is not true, that they were responsible when they weren't, torture them, and they'll give you whatever you want in terms of claiming, oh, I did it. So just a bad, by every measure, a bad thing to do.
And describe for me and the listeners who perhaps have forgotten what kinds of techniques were used, maybe an example or two of the kind of things that many of these prisoners underwent.
Sure. Well, the one that is kind of most infamous is waterboarding, and that's basically a technique that involves drowning someone. It's making so that you're pouring water over their nose and mouth so that they cannot breathe. Then you interrupt that before they die. There's also sleep deprivation. If you are prevented from sleeping for days at a time due to either physical brutality when you start to fall asleep, or loud noises, or bright lights, sleep deprivation is an awful experience. Same thing with solitary confinement. If you are put in a small room for weeks at a time with basically no contact with anyone, it destroys the mind. And there were others being put inside a coffin-sized box for hours at a time. Just beatings, sexual humiliation, being forced to wear, clothes that were offensive to your religion, being terrorized by military dogs. In one case, or more than one case, detainees were put on a leash and forced to perform dog tricks. This kind of humiliation. These are all things that our government did very vengefully and ineffectively if the goal was actually to obtain information to prevent future harm.
By the way, finally, along these lines, do you think that part of this was just simply an act of revenge, that people were acting out, not just simply from a psychological point of view, but just simply that there was an underlying anger, do you think, amongst the people who were performing this?
I absolutely believe that. There's the brutality, the vengefulness that was demonstrated through these acts certainly has the ring or evidence of revenge. And it was, you may recall, the president, right after 9/11, said that this was going to be a crusade, and the full wrath of the United States. Those are not messages of we are going to protect ourselves. That message is we are going to hurt people as much as we can. And that's what we did. And again, most of these people who suffered in this way were innocent. Even if they weren't innocent, I think it's still wrong. It's certainly wrong for a psychologist to be involved. But most of them had done nothing to deserve anything approaching this kind of mistreatment.
Now, in the book, and I've seen this elsewhere, Mitchell and Jess and Associates, they seem to be the key two psychologists that really began to lay out the playbook for this. Describe for me what their situation was about.
They were two military psychologists, James Mitchell, Bruce Jessen. They were close colleagues of each other. They retired from the military, and right after 9/11, they came to the CIA with recommendations for how to get information from prisoners who were resistant, who did not want to provide what we needed to know. And they developed what they called, or were called by the CIA, enhanced interrogation techniques. Most of us would call them torture. And the CIA embraced this. They immediately, in early 2002, started using these techniques on some captured prisoners. And ultimately, they set up a company. They were paid the company was paid $81 million by the U.S. government to run the CIA's interrogation program. And so those are the two psychologists. One was an APA member, the other wasn't, who are most infamous in this regard. But there were other psychologists involved, both for the CIA and at Guantanamo and elsewhere. And the APA did everything it could, seemingly, to keep psychologists involved in these interrogations. The APA claimed that by having psychologists there, it made these activities safe, legal, ethical, and effective, those four words. And that's not true. And it took years before the APA changed its policies.
Was this a matter of money, power, patriotism? What motivation do you see there for these individuals? Or is it just simply groupthink, I think you once suggested at one point?
Well, to a large extent, the individuals involved were following orders. I mean, they were basically doing what they were told. But I don't think there's any doubt that in addition to a sense of patriotism, the war on terror was seen as an opportunity. And there was a feeding frenzy among organizations and think tanks and other groups after 9/11 because there were tens of billions of dollars suddenly available for counterterrorism purposes. And the APA and psychology in the United States wanted to be part of that. This was seen as an opportunity to expand the roles that psychologists could play. And what the APA did that's so disturbing to me is that they consistently emphasized what psychologists were capable of doing, and they never really emphasized what psychologists should not do.
Now, there was the PENS report, like a Psychological Ethics and National Security Task Force, which attempted to, on the one hand, appear to address this, and yet on the other hand, certainly fell short, in your opinion.
Yeah, from my perspective and those of others, I'm not alone in this, the PENS Task Force was basically a stacked deck. The APA wanted to bring together a group that would advise them on what the APA's or psychology's stance should be toward interrogations. But they selected for the group, a majority of the members were in fact military intelligence psychologists, some of whom were part of the groups where the alleged abuses had taken place. It doesn't mean they were personally involved, but they were connected through chains of command, and there was no question that this group, this task force, given its composition, would conclude that psychologists have an important role to play in these detention and interrogation operations. And that's exactly what the task force concluded. But we could have known it from the outset just based on who was part of it.
Because one of the things that you try to point to is that there is a code of ethics on the one hand you may have, and yet there are laws or there are authorities that are telling you to do something else on the other. And it seemed as if, at least this report, tended to say, put the ethics code aside, you must abide by what you're being told. I mean, I guess you're referring obviously to the Nuremberg Code of Principle, as it were. Is that part of the problem, or was that a rationale that for these people, particularly given what we know now?
That was definitely part of the problem. It used to be that the ethics code was not so lenient, but changes were made just before 9/11, not as a result of 9/11, but then were approved by the governing board of the APA after 9/11. And they essentially said, if the ethics code conflicts with law or regulations or governing authority, you may put aside the ethics code and do what the law, regulations, or governing authority tells you to do. So it gave psychologists the permission to mistreat prisoners, and it took away from psychologists, they could no longer say, my code of ethics does not permit me to do this. They couldn't go to their commanding officer and say, I'm not allowed professionally, so I won't do it, because the APA code was changed in ways that made it permissible.
Of course, the individuals, some of them which you talk about, who participate in this, they weren't necessarily in the military. It wasn't as if someone was handing down an order saying, as a member of the armed forces, that you have to do X, Y, or Z, as it were. I mean, many of these were just simply voluntary. It almost like it opened the door for this.
Most of the psychologists who, certainly the ones at Guantanamo, were military psychologists. And initially, they were enlisted to do this kind of, be involved in the interrogation operations. Later on, the DOD only used psychologists who volunteered to do this. But many psychologists, were not involved in this. Many psychologists were doing valuable things during the War on Terror. They were helping with the care of our soldiers, our veterans. And in fact, I should note that right after 9/11, the APA did some great things. Specifically, they sent pro bono psychologists to New York City, to Washington, D.C., to other locations to help people deal with the trauma of that day, to help the families of the victims, to help first responders, to help children who were fearful in school. That was, in my view, psychology at its best. But then they also went in this other direction.
The other things about PENS, how did they deal with the fact that we did have all these media reports of what was going on in Guantanamo Bay, obviously Abu Ghraib, even events in Afghanistan itself?
You're exactly right. There were numerous reports, one after another, beginning as early as 2002. That was, in a sense, what prompted the APA finally in 2005 to decide, okay, we need to look into this. And that was the basis of the PENS task force. But they didn't really look into it, in my view, objectively, because they made sure the people on the PENS task force had a clear view that psychologists belong in these interrogations. But yes, there were media reports. It should not have been a surprise to the APA that psychologists were doing some awful things.
And then, of course, we have the Hoffman report, which seems to be a repudiation of Penn's. How did that come about, and what did it find, or what did it recommend, for that matter?
The Hoffman report was an independent review that the APA finally sought out in 2014, so 9 years after the Penn's report. And it concluded, it's over 500 pages long. There are thousands of pages of documentation. The report concluded that indeed APA leaders did covertly collaborate with the military and the intelligence community to make sure that psychologists remained at places like Guantanamo. The result of that was some changes in ethics policies so that psychologists could no longer participate in national security interrogations. They could no longer be present at Guantanamo unless they were working for the detainees or providing psychological care for the military personnel. These were important, valuable reforms. But ever since, the very same people who were part of the Penn's task force, the military, the intelligence community, have been trying to turn back the clock and push back and reduce APA's commitment to those ethics reforms. And they're succeeding.
Well, I was going to ask you, how do you see the future in terms of this organization after having undergone this issue of participation, and whether or not they will reverse themselves? I mean, what sense do you get?
Well, in my view, things are fragile. The policies put in place, the reforms still exist, but whether the APA will abide by them is unclear. And there's evidence, in the past few months, in the past year, that the APA leadership is not holding firm. Just last month, new guidelines were approved for the practice of certain types of psychology that could put psychologists back in similar roles. And those practice guidelines make barely any mention of the awful history of abuse and torture that psychologists were involved in. They make hardly any mention of APA's own prohibitions that were put in place, and yet the APA approved these guidelines. The other thing that bothers me a lot is that the APA has never been willing to do two things: to apologize to the victims of abuse and torture and their families. And the APA, despite the fact it donates tens of thousands of dollars a year to various nonprofit organizations doing good work, they seemingly refuse to donate money to organizations involved in the care of torture survivors and their families. It would be a valuable statement by the APA if they were to make regular contributions of that sort, and yet, when called upon to do so, they've not responded, let's put it that way, and they have not done it.
We've been speaking with Roy Eidelson. He is a member of the Coalition for an Ethical Psychology, also past president of Psychologists for Social Responsibility. He's written a new book entitled Doing Harm: How the World's Largest Psychological Association Lost Its Way in the War on Terror. We appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this afternoon.
I very much appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
You're listening to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.